"Dad, you don't need to rush back," my son said on the phone. His voice was calm, strangely calm. Mom just disappeared from the deck. I was in New York when I heard that. Outside, the window snow. In my ear, a stretch of silence that went on longer than it should have. My wife never let go of the railing when she was near the water. Never. And yet they told me it was an accident. An hour later, I found the new insurance policy, recently signed, worth $15 million. It doubled if the incident happened underwater. From that moment on, I knew something had broken. Not the ice on the lake, but my family. Before I tell you what happened next, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling me where you're listening from. Those messages remind me that I'm not telling this story into the void. And now, let's go back to that night. The moment when everything began to slip off course from a path I once believed was safe. I set the phone down without saying another word. At nearly 70 years old, I was used to bad news. Construction accidents, failed projects, partners who turned their backs. But some sentences, even very short ones, are enough to knock an entire life off its axis. Mom just disappeared from the deck. No one uses that word for someone they love, unless they have already prepared themselves for an ending. The overnight flight from New York to California felt longer than usual, not because of the weather, but because my mind kept circling every small detail. Martha hated cold water. She was afraid of depth, even of the gentle rocking of a boat. Every time we were on a yacht in Tahoe, she stayed close to the railing hands, gripping tight eyes fixed on the shore. I used to tease her, call her the shoreline guard, because she never took more than 2 steps away from what felt safe. And yet Julian said she slipped. A word that was far too convenient. When I got home, snow covered the driveway. The house was unnaturally quiet. Elena opened the door for me, her eyes red but dry. There was no smell of tears, only cold coffee and her familiar perfume. Julian sat upright in his chair, hands resting on his knees like he was waiting for an important meeting to begin. They both stood up at the same time when they saw me, as if rehearsed. I didn't hug them. I didn't ask many questions. I just looked around. In the living room, Martha's suitcase was still there, unopened. The shoes she always wore to the lake were placed neatly by the wall, clean and dry. A small detail, but it made me pause longer than necessary. If she had disappeared on the yacht, why were her shoes spotless? They told their story smoothly. A cold evening, strong wind. Martha stepped out onto the deck to get some air. A careless moment. Everything happened very fast. I nodded slowly like a father trying to accept the truth. I let them believe that I believed it. That night after the house had gone to sleep, I opened the drawer of my desk. I took out the insurance folder I hadn't touched in many years. Not because I feared the worst, but because Martha never liked talking about numbers tied to endings. She always said, if something happens, just let things be natural. I respected that, until nothing felt natural anymore. Inside the folder was a new addendum, signed 4 weeks earlier. An additional policy for unexpected incidents, with a special clause related to water environments. The amount was clearly stated, no room for guessing. I sat there for a long time. I didn't read it twice. As an engineer, I trust what can be measured, and numbers like that don't appear by accident. The next morning I went to the marina. The local police had already completed the necessary procedures. They spoke to me gently, using safe words, as if afraid of breaking something else. I thanked them, signed a few papers, then asked to be alone. The yacht was still there. I had helped install some of its equipment myself, just for fun, as I used to tell Martha. She would smile and say I never really stopped working. I stepped onto the deck and stood exactly where Julian said it happened. The railing was high enough. The floor had a non-slip surface. No signs of struggle, nothing out of place. But I wasn't looking for chaos. I was looking for silence. And the silence here was too perfect. When I got back home, I began playing the role of a broken husband. I let alcohol sit on the table. I let my eyes go emptier than usual. Elena watched me closely. She asked if I needed anything, her voice full of concern. Julian avoided my gaze, but kept checking his watch. Those reactions told me more than their story ever could. 3 days later, a call came from an unknown number. The woman on the line introduced herself as Sophia. Her voice was low and careful, as if she feared being overheard. She said she was caring for a female patient brought in during the night, found near the shore by fishermen. No identification, no family with her. But there was one detail that made her think of me. A ring engraved with the name Martha. I didn't ask anything else. I just said thank you and hung up. There are moments when one more word would cause everything to shatter. I put on my coat and told Julian I needed to go out for some air. He nodded, too quickly. On the drive, I didn't think about relief. I thought about the paradox. If Martha was alive, then what were all those tears in that house? And if she had been pushed out of her own life, then I would not let the truth sink beneath the cold ice of Tahoe. That thought stayed with me the entire way. Not loud, not angry, just a decision forming, slowly, firmly. When I stopped the car in front of the small lakeside hospital, I knew I had crossed a line. From this moment on, I was no longer the man waiting for answers. I would be the one opening every door that had been deliberately closed. The hospital room was so quiet I could hear the heater humming steadily behind the wall. Sophia stood a few steps from the bed, keeping a respectful distance. Martha lay there, smaller than I remembered, her skin pale, her damp hair carefully dried. Her breathing was steady but shallow, as if her body was learning how to be still again. I didn't touch her right away. I was afraid one careless movement might break that fragile moment. Sophia spoke briefly. Fishermen spotted a coat drifting near the shore. They brought her in during the night. No press, no noise. The water temperature was below the safe range. The body reacted in its own way. I nodded, listening without pressing for more. Some details don't need explanations yet. What I needed was the truth, still breathing. I signed a few forms as the only next of kin. My name written out the ink, still fresh. When Sophia asked if I wanted to notify the family, I shook my head, not out of selfishness. I just knew that once the information left this room, it would not come back the way I needed it to. I needed time, and I needed silence. Back at home, I continued my performance. I let the glass of liquor linger in my hand. I let my eyes drift across the family photos on the wall. Elena made tea without being asked if I had been able to sleep. I answered in short phrases. Julian talked about procedures, about lawyers, about things that should be done soon. I listened, but I didn't respond. People reveal the most when they believe the other person has already given up. When night fell, I went down to the garage. The yacht sat there, covered motionless, like a forgotten promise. I opened the technical compartment where I had once installed a journey data recorder and a few small cameras. Not to watch anyone, just for contingencies. An old engineer's habit. I connected the device and waited for the data to load. The screen filled with clean timelines. No slip, no sudden tilt, just one gap that stretched several minutes. Too smooth to be random. I shut everything down and put it all back exactly where it belonged. The truth doesn't need to be displayed early. It needs the right moment. The next morning I received an email from the insurance company. A confirmation of claim receipt, written in a cold professional tone. I read it slowly, line by line. At the bottom was the contact name, Elena. She had started this before I even understood what was happening. Once again, too fast. People who believe in accidents usually don't rush like that. I chose not to call the police. Not because I distrusted them, but because I understood my family. When things are exposed too early, the guilty close the doors very quickly. I needed them to believe the door was still open, that I was just an old husband, lost inside his grief. In the days that followed, I went back and forth between the house and the small lakeside hospital. I didn't talk much to Martha. I just told her harmless things. The snow was melting slowly. The pine tree outside the window was still standing. The familiar sparrow still came every morning. She didn't respond, but I knew she could hear me, and I trusted that her body was remembering the way back. Meanwhile, I began quietly reviewing the things Elena had left around the house. Not intruding, just observing. Schedules, printed emails, a few old folders. She had once worked in insurance consulting. The way her papers were arranged was too neat, too deliberate. I found a copy of Martha's medical file. Notes about low mood, sleep, difficulty, needs monitoring. The handwriting wasn't our family doctor's. The timestamps had been added later. I didn't get angry. I memorized it. One evening, when Julian was on the phone in the kitchen, his voice lowered but not low enough, I stood in the hallway. Numbers were mentioned. Short promises, long pauses. He hung up, turned, and met my eyes. He smiled and said it was work. I nodded, as if I had forgotten how to ask questions. Sophia called me late one afternoon. Martha was showing responses. Her hand twitched slightly when she heard my name. I sat beside the bed, placing my hand near hers, not touching. I spoke slowly, each word clear. I told her she was safe, that everything outside was being kept still, that I was here. Her breathing became more even. On the way home, I called Miller. We had known each other long enough to skip the formalities. I didn't tell him everything. I just said I needed advice. In silence. He understood. He didn't ask more, just told me not to rush. Let them walk into the light on their own, he said. I hung up, knowing a net was being woven. Knot by knot. When I opened the front door, Elena was already waiting, papers in her hand. She talked about progress, about signatures, about what Martha would have wanted. I looked into her eyes longer than usual. No trembling, just calculation. I signed. Not because I agreed, but because I needed them to believe their plan was still moving forward. That night I stood by the window looking out at the lake. The water was calm, reflecting distant lights. I thought about the paradox. To protect life, sometimes you have to pretend to accept the wrong story. I pulled the curtains closed and turned off the light. My investigation wasn't happening in interrogation rooms. It was unfolding in the silences they believed were safe, and every one of those silences was leading them closer to their own words. The silences grew heavier after I signed the papers. No one said it out loud, but both Julian and Elena changed their routines. Julian came home later, his phone never leaving his hand. Elena did the opposite. She appeared on time, perfectly composed, like she was performing the role of the attentive daughter-in-law. I watched, I took note, and I waited. One morning, after Julian rushed out of the house, I went into his study. Not to snoop, but to find something specific. People who live two lives always leave traces in the place they believe is safest. The bottom drawer was loosely locked. I opened it and found a thick stack of documents clipped with a cheap plastic cover. No logo, no title, just numbers and scheduled dates. Debt. Not a few small obligations. Lines of debt piled on top of each other, interest rates marked in red ink, unfamiliar names, temporary addresses. I didn't need to dig deeper to know this wasn't a failed investment. This was a spiral. And Julian was caught right in the middle of it. At the back of the stack was a copy of a birth certificate. The child's name was familiar. The dates were familiar, but the father's name had been clumsily blurred out. I stared at it for a long moment, then carefully peeled away the old tape. Another name appeared. Not Julian's. I sat down, letting my back rest against the desk. The room was silent. No ticking clock. Just the truth revealing itself. Slowly, but with certainty. The grandchild I held every weekend, the child Martha proudly showed to the neighbors, did not carry my son's blood. And Julian, the man who always bowed his head to his wife, had probably known this for a long time. That afternoon, Elena came home early. She hung up her coat, washed her hands, and walked into the kitchen like always. I stood by the dining table, the documents visible in my hand. I didn't ask a question. I placed them in the center of the table. Elena paused for a fraction of a second. Just enough for me to see it. Then she smiled and said Julian must have forgotten to put them away. You've always been good at organizing, I said evenly. Even the messiest things can be put back in order. Elena looked at me, her eyes no longer soft, but her voice stayed calm. I just want everything to be stable, she said. For the family. Family. An easy word to use, and a hard one to keep honest. I nodded, picked up the documents, and returned them to the drawer. Not yet. That evening, Miller stopped by. No uniform, no notebook. Just an old friend visiting. We sat in the living room under dim yellow light. I didn't show him the papers. I told him about the numbers, the names, the circle with no exit. Miller listened, then said slowly, if they're under pressure, they'll make mistakes. The mistake came sooner than I expected. A strange message appeared on my phone, sent by accident. Just one line. The money will be ready this week. Prepare to leave. No signature. But the timing matched an email from the insurance company confirming an emergency approval. The gears were starting to lock into place. I began leaving deliberate openings. I told Elena I was tired, that I didn't want to follow the paperwork so closely anymore. I let Julian overhear me talking to the bank about transfers. I played the role of a father letting go. They responded with impatience. They were less and less able to hide. Meanwhile, Sophia said Martha could react to familiar voices. I went to the hospital during quiet hours. I told her stories without names. I said some doors were about to open, that she didn't need to remember anything. Just breathe steadily. Her hand squeezed a little tighter than before. I took it as a promise. One night, Julian came home with a small scrape on his wrist, hidden under a long sleeve. I didn't ask. I handed him a glass of water. He drank it quickly, avoiding my eyes. In that moment, I didn't see a bad man. I saw a son who had gone too far without knowing how to come back. Elena was different. She began packing discreetly. Small things disappeared first. Passports placed into a new handbag. She thought I wouldn't notice. But a man who has spent a lifetime with blueprints and tolerances doesn't miss small deviations. Miller called me early one morning. He said everything was ready if I wanted to take the next step. I looked out at the lake, the water gray and flat. I thought about the final paradox. To expose a truth, sometimes you have to let it reach the end of itself. I organized a small memorial gathering. Quiet. No press. Just family and a few acquaintances. Elena looked surprised, then quickly agreed. Julian stayed silent. I said I needed one evening to bring things to a close. They believed me, or they thought they had won. When I sent out the final invitations, I knew I was placing a stone exactly where it belonged. Not to destroy, but to force everything to stand still. Because when secrets are pressed into one room, they will eventually find their own voice. And this time I intended to listen, all the way to the end. The evening was scheduled for the heaviest snowfall of the week. I didn't choose it at random. At my age, I no longer believe in coincidence. The lakeside villa was lit early, warm yellow light spilling onto the white snow, creating a false sense of comfort. A perfect place to say goodbye, or to open something up. Julian arrived first. He wore a dark suit collar, neatly set his face tight like a contract nearing its deadline. Elena came after him, carrying a leather bag, her high heels replaced with lower ones than usual. A small detail. But it said more than any greeting. They exchanged a quick look, then turned to me together like two people waiting for a signal. I invited them into the living room. No flowers, no candles, none of the usual things for a memorial. Just a few old family photos on the wall, Martha smiling, standing between Julian and me, her hand resting on her daughter-in-law's shoulder. I let them see it. I didn't comment. Silence did the rest. Julian's business partner arrived a few minutes late. A quiet man, eyes always measuring the exits. I shook his hand and introduced myself briefly. No one asked questions. Everyone carried their own story, and tonight wasn't the moment to tell them yet. We sat down. I began with simple words. About Martha. About winter. About how people often believe they still have plenty of time. My voice was steady, slow, without extra emotion. I saw Elena exhale, relieved. She thought I was playing my part. An old husband, closing the past. Then I turned on the screen. Home videos appeared. Julian as a child running across the lawn. Martha laughing, shading her son from the sun. Elena in the early years, gentle and reserved. The room softened. Even the stranger leaned back in his chair as if the evening would pass quietly. I let the footage run long enough for their guard to drop. Then the images faded. No more family. Only audio recordings. Elena's voice. Low, certain. Fragmented sentences that needed no explanation. Numbers. Promises. Plans spoken with absolute confidence. Julian jumped to his feet first. He said it was a misunderstanding. Elena stayed seated, eyes locked on the screen. The stranger gripped the arm of his chair, jaw clenched. No one could keep pretending. "Turn it off," Elena said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was firm. I didn't answer. I let the final recording play. A long stretch of silence. Then the familiar line. All we need is for it to happen underwater. No one spoke after that. Outside, the snow fell heavier, the wind tapping against the glass in steady beats. I stood up and turned off the living room lights. The only light left came from the long hallway leading to the back of the house. At the end of the hallway, a figure stood still. Elena saw it first. She stepped back, one hand grabbing the table. Julian turned his face, draining of color. The figure didn't move forward. It stayed far enough to blur the face. Close enough to be undeniable. Light reflected off a familiar ring. There was no scream, just sharp breathing. Elena shook her head, whispering that it couldn't be real. The stranger cursed under his breath, then fell silent, as if realizing he had already said too much. I didn't explain what it was. I didn't need to. In that moment, fear did the work for me. Not fear of the dark, but fear of the truth returning, standing right in front of them, needing no explanation. Elena turned to Julian. Her voice broke. She spoke about pressure, about promises she couldn't keep, about how everything had slipped out of control. Julian collapsed back into his chair, hands covering his head. The stranger edged toward the door, then froze when he heard footsteps behind him. Miller appeared with two others. No rush, no drama, just a presence solid enough to make every next word irreversible. The recording device on the table had been running since the start of the evening. I stood still, looking at each of them in turn. No judgment, no anger, just listening. Because when people believe they have lost everything, they finally say what they have hidden the longest. When it was over, the room fell quiet again. The figure at the end of the hallway was gone. The lights came back on. Snow, still falling. I looked out the window and felt a strange emptiness. Not victory, just the knowledge that some doors once opened never close the same way again. I put on my coat and stepped outside, letting the cold touch my face. Tonight wasn't the end. It was simply the point where pretending was no longer possible. And in the silence of the snow, I prepared for what came last. Not for revenge, but to redraw the boundaries of what had once been called family. The next morning, the snow stopped falling. Lake Tahoe revealed a calm, flat surface, as if the night before had only been a long dream. I stood in the kitchen, making coffee out of old habit, listening to the steady sound of boiling water. The remaining procedures moved along neatly without noise. Every word had been recorded, every document placed where it belonged. I didn't need to follow closely. Some things, once they step into the light, know how to move on their own. Julian didn't look at me when he left the house. He paused at the doorway, back turned, and whispered a small apology. I didn't answer. Not because I didn't hear him, but because some apologies arrive too late to become answers. I only hoped he still had enough time to learn how to live with his own truth. Elena was different. She didn't say anything more. Her eyes were empty, like someone who had just taken off a mask worn for too long. I felt no satisfaction, just a quiet space finally filled with the silence it needed. I went to the hospital once the sun was up. Sophia greeted me with a gentle nod. Martha kept her eyes open longer than the day before. She looked at me slowly, as if piecing together scattered memories. I took her hand this time without hesitation. It was warmer. I told her she was safe, that we would be going home soon. I didn't mention the snowy night, or what had been exposed. Not to hide it, but to let her heal without carrying more weight. In the days that followed, life settled into a new rhythm. I walked around the lake every morning, counting my steps, watching the snow melt slowly. Miller called a few times with updates, but I kept my answers brief. I didn't need details. I needed a real ending, one that didn't drag the pain any further. When the insurance matters were resolved, I sat alone in my study. The thick stack of papers lay on the desk, the numbers clear. I thought about old conversations with Martha, about using money for something useful, about not letting other people's mistakes define the rest of our lives. I signed what needed, signing my hand steady. Not to hold on, but to pass it on. The support fund was set up quietly. No large signs. No long speeches. Just regular assistance for people who needed a door opened at the right moment. Elderly folks forgotten by time. Families standing on the edge of silent collapse. I didn't put my name on it. I only wanted it to exist as something that should be done. Martha came home on a sunny afternoon. She walked slowly, leaning on my arm. The house was the same, but the air felt different. She asked where Julian was. I said he was handling some personal matters. She nodded, didn't ask more. Some questions, when left unspoken, are also a form of protection. That evening we sat by the window, watching the lake change color with the sunset. Martha told me fragments of memory. A wet coat, distant lights, a long sleep. I listened without correcting her. Memory, like water, needs to be left alone to settle on its own. I realized that peace doesn't come from things returning to how they were. It comes from accepting that some things have changed forever, and that you can still move forward without denying it. I took care of Martha each day through small things. Medication on time, short walks, stories without names. She smiled more. The smile wasn't whole like before, but it was real. One morning I opened my old toolbox and adjusted the railing on the deck. Not because it was necessary, but because I wanted things to be safer next time. I worked slowly, carefully, the way I've lived my whole life. When I finished, I stood there for a while, letting the cold wind brush my face. No more paradoxes, just clarity. I didn't tell this story to seek sympathy. I told it because there are families standing at crossroads they don't yet recognize. Family isn't just the names written on documents. Family is the people who know when to stay silent and when to speak. The ones who don't walk away when things turn cold. If you're listening this far, remember one simple thing. Don't confuse blood with loyalty. Some doors need to be closed so others can open. And sometimes justice doesn't arrive with noise, but with a decision made in silence. Steady enough, slow enough, and kind enough for those left behind to keep living. If you stayed with me through these final moments, thank you for listening to a story that wasn't easy to tell. If it made you pause and think, tap. Like to support, subscribe so you don't miss future stories. And share it if you believe someone else needs to hear it. Your support isn't loud, but it matters. It allows stories like this to be told. Slowly, honestly, and with enough kindness. Thank you for your time. I wish you and your family peace, even through the coldest winters.